Over the past few weeks, President-elect Donald Trump announced a series of threats towards Greenland, Panama, and Canada, stating that it is within their national interest to control these countries, causing many in the West to feel threatened by the former president's second term. So in this video we will be briefly asking what these countries could actually do to defend themselves, and what a possible confrontation between them could actually look like. So what would the states gain from this? Well, for Greenland, it could act as a nuclear test site, as well as a training ground for winter conditions, mainly for special forces units like Navy SEALs. It would also enhance the US presence in the north, which has recently been grown to be contested by China and Russia, as well as act as a naval outpost, similar to how NATO utilises Iceland's ports. Next is Panama. The Panama Canal is a vital trade route for ships, leading the USA to Europe, Asia, and Australia. However, Panama charges all ships that pass through, so controlling it might allow easier, cheaper routes for the US Navy. As for Canada, it has a fairly strong economy with a GDP of 2.14 trillion, alongside some pretty capable equipment in their military, so the USA would likely inherit all of these factors among others. It will also finally attach the dissected Alaska to the US mainland. So what could these countries actually do to defend themselves? Well, for Greenland, they're actually defended by the Danish military, so as a result it would be up to them to protect Greenland. If we had to compare their militaries, the US has about a total of 1.3 million personnel, with about 800,000 reserves. The Danish, on the other hand, have a much smaller 20,000 personnel with about 12,000 reserves. The US spends about 831 billion on defence. In comparison, the Danish spend about 6 billion. As for armour, well, the US operates about 4,657 tanks, 360,000 armoured vehicles, and about 3,556 total artillery weapons. The Danish operate 44 tanks, 4,056 armoured vehicles, and 19 total artillery weapons. Now, in the air, the US operates about 13,000 aircraft, 1,854 of which are fighter aircraft, 896 are dedicated attack aircraft, and about 957 are transport aircraft. The Danes operate about 119 total aircraft, 33 of which are fighter aircraft, and 4 are dedicated attack, and another 4 are transport aircraft. For helicopters, the US operates 5,737 total helicopters, 1,000 of which are attack helicopters. The Danes operate only 34 helicopters, and 0 of which are attack helicopters. In the sea, it's not much better either. The US operates 473 total vessels, 11 aircraft carriers, 9 helicarriers, and 64 submarines. The Danes operate 91 vessels, and none of which are either aircraft carriers, helicarriers, or submarines. As for combat vessels, the US operates 75 destroyers, 0 frigates, and 23 corvettes, alongside just 5 patrol vessels. The Danes operate no destroyers, 9 frigates, no corvettes, and only 45 patrol vessels, which however is more than their US counterparts. So after looking at these figures, you may figure that the Danish have no chance at defending Greenland against the US. However, they have one advantage. The Danish are well trained for Greenland's environment. You see, while US troops are well trained for all environments, the Danish are specialised for cold and snowy conditions, giving their personnel a potential upper hand, which could make the US reliant on some of its best trained forces to match them. A potential conflict would also rely on international intervention. Groups like NATO and the EU might potentially fund the Danish. However, there is a possibility that intervention might be limited, as the US alone makes up over half of NATO's security policy, especially as many NATO countries rely on the US to operate a large portion of their weapons alongside ammunition manufacture. Now let's look at Canada. They operate about 68,000 active personnel with about 27,000 reserves. 26.5 billion of their GDP is also spent on defence each year. The Canadians also operate 24 tanks, 18,000 armoured vehicles, and 0 total artillery. In the air, the Canadians operate about 375 total aircraft, 65 of which are fighter aircraft, 0 are dedicated attack aircraft, and about 28 of those are transport aircraft. For helicopters, Canada operates about 143 total helicopters, however 0 of which are attack helicopters. As for warships, the Canadians operate a total of 67 vessels, none are aircraft carriers or helo-carriers. However, they do operate 4 submarines. For surface combatants, they have no destroyers, 12 frigates, 0 corvettes, and 12 patrol vessels. A US invasion of Canada would likely be disastrous. The US have Canada on 2 major fronts, Alaska and the mainland. As both of these countries share the world's largest border, Canada would most likely lack the personnel to defend it, so the armed forces would most likely be overwhelmed by the US numerically. It also makes things worse when Canada's largest cities are also situated at the same border. A war would likely see these cities quickly overrun as Canadian forces do attempt to burrow in to defend them. While Canada is well equipped with weapons like the Leopard tank, it would still greatly rely on Allied aid, which as mentioned before might not be as spectacular as Canada would hope it to be. Now lastly there is Panama, which is a very unique case as it actually has no standing army. All that exists is a lightly armed paramilitary group that outnumbers 80,000 personnel. A US naval invasion will likely see large-scale guerrilla warfare and some form of resistance from the Panama paramilitary groups. However, with few other powerful allies, it would likely collapse to a US invasion fairly quickly. Now, for the rest of NATO, this would be a very large test, and it would start serious conversation on US reliance. Not that in some places it hasn't happened already. NATO countries are heavily defended by US bases of all kinds, so greatly that if the US decided to launch an invasion on one of its allies, the organisation might be hesitant to impose sanction or in some way turn on the US. If the US was to go ahead and invade one of its allies, they would be a tough decision to make. NATO countries would have to choose between upholding the NATO Article 5 Mutual Defence Act in a reaction to a Greenland or Canadian invasion, or maintain good relations with the US for national security and other reasons. The UK in particular have had quite a turbulent relationship with the US in recent times, which has tested the UK's so-called special relationship with the US, mainly over an online argument between tech billionaire Elon Musk and Prime Minister of the UK, Keir Starmer, largely over controversial figures like Tommy Robinson and others. However, despite this, the Prime Minister has not yet spoken publicly about the President-elect's invasion threats to its allies. If you enjoyed this video and want to be notified when we release our next one, please consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell so you know when our channel next uploads.